Open.
Me? So you can call me Alf, E, Alfred, whichever you want.
Okay.
Before, when we first started, we would just like walk in, start speaking. Everybody's getting like all set up. Now we've got all the like the professional kit. We've got like the timing on point. We've got the walk down, etc., etc. Rory, it's becoming a little bit more a thing now.
Do you think there'll be a sort of backlash and a return to the lo-fi podcast market where everything's kind of recorded on handheld phones? And because it's gone, the production values have gone crazy, haven't they?
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, it's going even crazier because Netflix have obviously just announced that they're doing a collaboration with Spotify to be able to take some of the best podcasts on Spotify and take them over to Netflix as a test and learn. So I think a lot of the podcasts are going to now start thinking about themselves as shows and starting to up their game even more, because there's this whole like concept about the fact that the way that you like differentiate yourself now is with like set design and like mood and art direction and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's always really important to make sure that the conversation stays at the center of everything. And with that being said, I was really excited about this conversation. So I was speaking to Rory about this and the team, and Rory raved on about the fact that we need to get Jessica on, right? And I then got obsessed because that's the way that I am. Whenever people get excited about somebody, I get excited. I do my research, and I was like, you know what? As somebody that's a bit of a digital native or social native, I looked at some of your work and I was really excited about what I found, and also like the work you've done so far, and also the conversations you were having. But I'm not going to butcher, but then I mind the pun, right? But we always love to let our guests lead that intro so they can almost like be in charge of their story, and then we can just talk about some of the bottlenecks you discovered across your journey. But Jessica, great to give you the floor. Tell our audience that may not know who you are about yourself, the work you've been doing, and we can start to dive right into the bottlenecks as well.
Amazing. Thank you for having me. This is so impressive and lovely. So the story has been a very squiggly career to date. I'm a tech entrepreneur, basically. Yeah. I have been for the best part of 25 or so years. Mm-hmm. So I've been in the business of building or helping to build platforms that mine attention, not to put too fine a point on it. Yeah. So I rode the coattails of a lot of entrepreneurs in my 20s, cutting my teeth and learning and basically following inspiring visionaries and learning, how to help take their visions to market. And my role has always been on the communication side. Mm-hmm. So storytelling about why this is going to change the world, why it's so awesome, why everybody should be buying it or engaging with it. And I find it quite hilarious I'm called a woman in tech because I've got a history degree and I can't read or write a line of code, never have. But I love nerds. Yeah. And I guess I describe my superpower as being nerd translating. So I would get the techies to say what they were so excited about. Yeah. And then I'd say, what I can hear is, would this be a fair representation of that? Yeah. And then my job was always to attract adherence to that vision, whether that was investors, media, clients, or the end consumer in some way or another. So I've always done a sort of hybrid sales partnership.
In defense of that, Steve Jobs couldn't code either, could he?
I've heard that. I'm in good company.
I mean, the Beatles couldn't read music. It's not necessary, actually, for the primary role of a business, necessarily to be understood by the people who actually uncover the value. Yeah. It's quite interesting.
I mean, I like to think of myself as an amateur behavioral psychologist, trying to find the trigger points of how somebody is going to engage or get excited about it, and then tapping into that and firstly working out who those people are going to be, and then finding the right way to take that message to market with them.
And you always need a degree of translation, don't you? Because the thing about the people with the greatest technological ability typically is they're principally motivated either by the intrinsic difficulty of the problem or by the urge to impress each other. And of course, their peer group isn't really representative of the wider consumer.
Absolutely.
And so they'll quite often pursue metrics which in some ways are either irrelevant to or are difficult to translate into actual consumer benefits.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I also think one thing I've also learned throughout my career is the power of the generalist.
Yeah.
The generalist that sits at the junction of lots of different industries. And my scrappy CV, where I moved jobs every 2 years throughout my 20s, actually really helped, because I had a little bit of insight into a lot of different sectors and industries. And it meant that I could look at a technology and apply it in multiple different directions in ways that hadn't been seen before. And those are often really powerful roles to play in the cross-pollination of different technologies and industries.
There's a weird debate in AI about this online at the moment, which is some AI people say the only way to survive as a paid human being is a super specialist.
Yeah.
In other words, you're actually above the abilities of the AI. Now, that seems to me quite a risky bet.
Oh, yeah.
The other argument is completely the opposite, which is to say that bizarrely generalists, almost to the point of dilettantes, people with a very, very wide mixed humanities and tech background, in fact, they're the most valuable people because they can cross domain more easily.
Yeah, we talk about the fact that I think we use the analogy of being more Quincy Jones and less Michael Jackson, right? If you can conduct an orchestra, that's actually where your skills can almost like come to light, really, because can you look at all these different tools and use it towards almost like a united goal, right? And I think that there was always the conversation around like the purist versus the storyteller, right? And a lot of the times purists are almost like in this cycle where they're just on their own and they're not able to translate the magic that's happening within that tribe to the rest of the world. And people like Steve Jobs are able to understand the world and become that bridge. Would you say that's kind of like the role that you were playing as the generalist within the tech space in the early days?
Absolutely. That's what I've done in every single role. That was the only consistency, actually, that sort of bridge role, because I went from the film industry to loyalty schemes, to the travel industry, to international trade.
Yeah.
It was messy as hell. It was a CV that said susceptible to unscrupulous recruitment consultants. That's what it said. And I kind of had to make sense of it. And everybody creates their own narrative, right, to a certain extent. But that was the underlying thing that I would see something, I would translate it, and I would cross-pollinate to help take to market.
Yeah.
But I guess I got to a stage, so I had a real rocket ship experience in the 2010s.
Yeah.
So with Blippar, I was part of the founding team that built one of the very first AR platforms in the world. And it was such an exciting time because it was the first time technology had been seen, and we just took off like a rocket. So, from the four of us, we had 10 offices around the globe. We were a unicorn for a brief period of time. And it catapulted me onto all of these stages and into all of these networks. And everybody wanted to put me up for awards or speaking, because there were so few women in high tech at that stage. And that was where some of the imposter syndrome came in with the, I don't understand tech, but I understand the creative applications of this really cool tech. So that was what I was doing, thinking through at that stage. So here's what the tech can do. What could that mean for the FMCG industry? What can that mean for print publishing? What can that mean for outdoor? What can that mean for industry and educational tools and platforms? My breadth was the advantage at that stage because I could think through really creative ideas and seed those into the client conversations that we were having. But just to bring us up to date, I guess, towards around 2017, 2018, I also had 3 children in 4 years. I decided to take a step out of the front seat of the rocket simply because I couldn't live on a plane anymore. And I also wanted to enjoy those years, so wrestled with a lot of that sort of feminist narrative about, being the girl boss and thinking, well, actually, what do I actually want? And, what do I prioritize now at this stage of my life? And that was when I basically moved into a portfolio career for sort of 4 or 5 years. So some angel investing, a lot of consulting, and some board work. I sat on the board of the government's Equality and Human Rights Commission for 4 years, which was eye-opening, eye-watering in many ways. But all of this, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I suppose, I've been doing a sort of deep dive, almost PhD, in looking at so many of the very dramatic, fast-moving trends and shifts that we're seeing in society, from polarization, which obviously is huge in the equalities realm, to the rising rates of anxiety and mental health challenges, to distraction and attention deficit disorder and what's happening there. And it struck me that there was just an underlying technical reason why so many of these were happening. And it wasn't that tech was the cause of them all, but what it was, without doubt, an accelerant, pouring fuel on the flames of so many of these very worrying, divisive trends that we're seeing. And I, reading, talking, networking, I was fortunate to have quite some time with Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the book around the anxious generation. I've met a lot of activists that are doing incredible work within this area, and I've now got a great network of incredible people that know a huge amount about the behavioral science of what's happening, the impact on children, the impact in schools, and a lot of regulators that are talking about this. But where do I fit in? It's like, I want to work on this problem, but how do I bring my skills and background and, the secret sauce of Jess to this challenge? And that's when we come back to this, how does a generalist storyteller and an optimistic entrepreneur, how can I contribute to it? And that's where the idea for Scroll Aware has evolved, an alliance of incredibly influential people and brands, those brands and people that do influence culture, coming together and saying, we recognize there's a challenge, that, it's not the phone that's the problem, and it's not technology that's the problem. I'm a tech entrepreneur. They are not to blame. It is very specifically, the major issue is the business models that are predicated on time and attention, because there's only one way to go with business models like that, which is to go down into our basest human instincts, our desire for our insecurities, our desire for tribalism and to feel right, the dopamine of, turning our brains off, and we are now living, I think, in a very, very extreme version of that, where we are living more to be seen to live. And spending, such a huge percentage of our lives in these platforms. It profoundly worries and depresses me. I think we're in the process of lobotomizing, ourselves, but more importantly and profoundly, a whole generation of young people who simply will not have the ability to concentrate and focus at a time when the problems of the world are getting profoundly more and more difficult and challenging. Our attention is all we have.
Oh, 100%. I have there was so many points that I wanted to touch from there.
I could talk.
Yeah, literally, I started with multi-hyphenated, right? You call it a generalist, right? But I think we're going into this space where the age-old question of, well, who do you want to be when you grow up, or what do you want to do when you grow up? There's no longer one answer now, right? Would you say that was always the case for you? Or would you say that you first had a love for tech, and because of the exposure and almost like the aha moment that derived from you being in that space, did your world open up and you wanted to experiment and try this skill on different things? Or was that always the plan? Was that just like an entryway, or was that the way and then the world opened up for you?
There was no plan. I'd love to say I had a plan. I've always seen shiny things at the corner of my eye. Things that just fascinated me and interest me. And I open doors and make memories. And out of those, some fabulous career opportunities have arisen, and some mistakes. That's why I refer to it as squiggly. God, I've made some mistakes in my career as well. But I've never had a great plan, basically, and I think that's something I've often thought is a weakness. But I'm a very gut-based decision maker, and it served me well. So I'm not sure I'm going to shake it up to
Yes, actually, one problem with over planning is you can't be healthily opportunistic, and also it makes it very, very difficult to use intuition. Because and you make the mistake, I think, that you only count as a success those things that you'd planned in advance.
Yeah.
Which is, in a sense, you're a hostage to fortune.
Oh, yeah.
Because instead of actually accepting the fact that there are possibly, 47 different futures for you, you become fixated with only one of them.
Yeah.
And it's simply, by the way, not how the world works. And actually, most of what we consider to be, our career path is really reverse engineered.
Yeah.
It's a narrative we construct to make sense of the past, even though it played very little role in the present. And they're wonderful phrases about this. I like the military one, which is plans are useless, but planning is essential. So all military people accept that once you engage with the enemy, nothing is going to go to plan. There are occasions where you're absolutely right to disobey orders because the situation has changed in some unexpected way. But at the same time, the preparation part of planning is still useful. And I think it sounds like a contradictory phrase, but actually what it captures is the fact that there are kind of two kinds of planning. There's healthy preparation, which is a sense knowing enough to get lucky, perhaps. Okay. But then there's the obsession with there is only one possible route to success, which I think is actually dangerously narrowing. And by the way, creates a bottleneck because you tend to end up with the same path as everybody else.
Yeah.
If you consider the sort of Blair era, 50% of people must go to university. That was effectively creating a single narrative for what it meant to have a good job.
Yeah.
Which then meant that 50% of the population tried to succeed in exactly the same way. So nobody really thought of the second order effects of creating this particular story.
Yeah, they said that it happened in South Africa as well. So I think in the Nelson Mandela era, there was this whole drive to get everybody to go to university as well. But then they didn't create the jobs for the people once they finished university. So then you had a lot of people with degrees, but then there was no opportunities to be able to actually capitalize on that. So now you have a lot of very smart, educated people, but the opportunities are not ready. I saw that when I lived in Dubai, for example. There was a lot of almost like the population's going up, but then there's still traffic jams because the roads haven't caught up, right?
No.
Which is what is super interesting. And I say that you mentioned about the fact that every one of these social platforms are driving towards time and attention, right? And you see this with the AI race, right? Everyone's trying to be first to the AI, almost like mega status, if you will, but they don't know the impact that's happening on day-to-day reality, right? It's almost like everyone's in this tunnel vision and they don't know what they're breaking. Ironically, the move fast and break things is effectively the theory that drives that.
There's a very useful distinction, which can be useful in, for example, investor behavior. It can be useful in understanding all kinds of things, which is a lot of behaviors are micro-rational but macro-stupid. So it's an intelligent thing to do from your own point of view, except at the point when other people start trying to do exactly the same thing. I would argue in a lot of online performance advertising is of that kind. It's micro-rational but macro-stupid in the sense that effectively, instead of working out a way to avoid giving half your revenue to Meta and Alphabet, people are basically so fixated on this channel that what they're all doing is trying to give slightly less of their money. Or to give their money in a slightly more efficient way. And so it's what you might call that form of hyper-competition where it seems rational to compete. But if you take a step back, you can simply say, actually, the prize isn't worth the price. And I think that there is undoubtedly a human urge. Obviously, we're highly comparative in our perception. And the first benchmark we'll use for our own success is other people. But what you don't realize while you're doing that is you're effectively allowing someone else to define what it means to be successful, happy, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and Jessica, you talked about that, right? Obviously, you talked about the fact that at the start, you're obviously part of this tech revolution, building this organization, drilled into this. And then there was a change moment when you started to realize the impact. Can you double down into that? Like, what was the catalyst for that realization and change?
I mean, it's pretty obvious in some ways and boring, but becoming a parent and thinking about what the world's going to be like for my children, and observing all of these trends accelerating to such a huge extent, that
it's sort of like J. Robert Oppenheimer, which is "I am become death." You see the first H-bomb, and I imagine he was pretty proud at that moment, but he suddenly became aware of the consequences.
Yeah, it's a really worrying world for children to grow up in.
Yeah.
Just the examples that they see in the world around them. I mean, the evidence and the data is there in terms of harms and the specific nature of, the risks of the type of content. I guess what's happened to my thinking is I've kind of tracked up from that, because I think enough people are doing fantastic work on talking about online harms.
No.
I'm more worried about the sheer time opportunity cost, the sheer amount of time that is being lost. I mean, the statistics at the moment say that the average 18-year-old is on course to spend 25 years of the rest of their life in scroll.
Wow.
That terrifies me from the perspective of my own children. And those
25 years of their waking life.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so
that's
actually
after you've taken sleep and work, going to the toilet, eating,
that's
personal
25
hygiene,
years scrolling.
Out. Yes, scrolling.
So, that's a sort of fentanyl scale problem, isn't it?
It's utterly terrifying. That's the one problem, the time opportunity cost. Because what else?
One question. When we think about harms, there's a very good argument to oppose the legalization of cannabis, which is not that it's bad for everybody. Probably isn't. But there are certain behaviors, gambling would be another one, alcohol would be a third, which are neutral or marginally beneficial to a lot of people, but catastrophically bad to a certain minority. And, I've always thought, this is a slightly weird defense of nicotine, but smoking was quite bad for quite a lot of people, right? Whereas alcohol gambling and certain other behaviours strike me as very different, which is there is a chunk of the population who can handle them perfectly well. But I imagine if you're long-term unemployed and you have a really heavy cannabis habit, I imagine your chances of getting out of that trough are pretty slim. And so I'm interested to know what's the variance in terms of the people where it's a problem. My own daughters, actually, I would have said they navigated their teenage years. Now, they're 25 now, but I'd say 24, actually. They navigated their teenage years fairly well. I wasn't ever alarmed. I had a Minecraft obsessive daughter for a time and so forth, but that struck me as not an appalling use of time. It was reasonably creative and it was social and engaging. Would I have wished that they were brought up in a world without that technology? Probably not. I mean, there was still a downside and there was still an opportunity cost, undoubtedly. But I was just interested in the question of, and there is a perfectly good social reason for banning things which quite a lot of people like if they're appallingly bad for some. And I was just interested in
I don't agree in bans. Absolutely not.
Okay.
I'm pro-tech, I'm pro-phones, and I am actually pro-social.
Although school bans of smartphones.
I think bell to bell, what they've done for schools is brilliant. And immediately they implement bell to bell, which means from 9 to 3 in the working day, phone off body, not on the child at all. They see the results go up, they see the politics go down, they see, so much more stability and happiness. So why not? And there's some brilliant work that has happened where teachers can make that call for themselves within the classroom. And obviously the parenting grassroots community is doing great work in terms of educating parents about potentially delaying, so no one child is stigmatized, and thinking about what they do on the device. I guess where I've landed is, it's about balance. And there was a slogan that sort of came to me that has unlocked a lot of the actual structure of what I'm building now, which is Scrollaware's mantra is less scroll, more soul.
Yeah.
Now, Jimmy Carr, when we were together, referred to it as a bit twee, but it really resonates because it juxtaposes these two ideas. Now, scroll is very obvious what scroll is. Soul is deliberately ambiguous.
Yeah.
Because each and every one of us will define that word differently. You know, for one person, it might be something really nerdy, you know, train spotting, or, you know, bird watching, or, you know, building little, you know, wall figures or something. For somebody else, it's long form fiction, or going for walks, or doing fitness and exercise, or time with your girls. For most middle-aged professional men right now, it's paddle. Seemingly, you know,
I love paddle.
More soul. I would describe soul time as anything that is sort of people, place, perspective.
Okay.
And if you look at these two things in opposition, which they are, you know, you start to think then about building something, a campaign, an alliance that is motivated on simply rebalancing. And that's all I believe in, the rebalancing. Because tech, including social media, should be a bridge and an enabler for our real lives. It shouldn't be a destination where we spend our lives. And that's the tipping point that I think we've reached now, which is so worrying, because it stopped us spending time in our own heads with our own thoughts. We're on this productivity, you know, absorb more, you know, hack our way to this. You know, no one goes for a walk now without a podcast on. You know, I've got to multitask. I've got to use this time. And that pace of life and this hyper optimization of everything that we're doing, it's just leaving us overwhelmed. Everybody is overwhelmed. And the scroll to soul dichotomy is simply saying, slow down and make time for the things that calm you, the things that improve you.
It's mandatory to ask this question, but is there an AI solution to this? Which is quite simply, you know, we all know famously that Simon Cowell doesn't have a mobile phone. He has people around him with mobile phones.
Ed Sheeran
who
as well.
effectively, Ed Sheeran the same. They relay what is important. Now, most of us can't afford that at the moment, nice as it would be to have an entourage. I always wanted my own mariachi band. That was my dream. But It should be possible that you could reverse the direction of travel so that you have an AI agent, which is simply very versed in filtration and prioritization. I'm also vaguely excited by the potential for new formats for devices. So much as it pains me to admit it, I think Zuck is right to bet on these meta glasses. Which
here we go.
No. Oddly, provided you can calibrate them to an acceptable level of interruption, my view is that's actually positive, not negative, because a lot of our compulsive behavior is driven by fear of missing something. And therefore, if you know that if anything important had happened, my spectacles would have told me about it, so I can now relax and go on a walk. My argument is that actually a large part of this is the advertising model. Which I think I, as an advertising person, I can't really hold myself fully responsible. But that old comment that effectively, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. There's a really interesting debate in subscription publications where most of the user base pay for the content, which is to say we don't have to go in for all that clickbait or nastiness simply because they've already paid. Our job now is to entertain them. Their attention is effectively irrelevant to our business model. And consequently, we can focus on doing the proper job of a journalist or the proper job of an entertainer rather than having to create scandal or mischief. So, and the third one, when I said about other formats, my perfect phone would be a Samsung flip phone where the outer casing was basically, a feature phone. It was simply a black and white screen on the outside, which enabled me to do all the really urgent, very urgent stuff or simply receive calls, and that you could limit the number of times you could open it in a day. And so it would turn into a tablet. And what a lot of what we're talking about is batch processing versus constant interruption, isn't it? Which is in the good old days when my computer was upstairs, which is where the ISDN line came in. So this is getting really nostalgic. There was literally an ISDN line upstairs. I had a large computer upstairs and I went upstairs and I used the internet and then I came downstairs again. And the great thing about that is that the place determined the focus. So in the old days, in the 1980s, in the working environment, when you're in a meeting room, you had a meeting. When you're in the photocopy room, you photocopied. When you were in the pub, you had a chat. And the smartphone kind of fucked it all by effectively being.
You didn't mention the toilet.
Well, then you read the newspaper. Yeah. No. In my childhood, you read Giles cartoons on the
father had them all.
Wow, that's a bit of nostalgia. everybody under sort of 45 is going, "What the fuck is he talking about?" Or if you're a bit down market, George and Lynn from The Sun. But the point about that is that the place determined the performance.
Yeah.
And so you were forced to focus by dint of the specificity of the place in which you found yourself. Yeah. And the smartphone came and effectively smashed through that.
Yeah.
Now, it's not all bad. I mean, I would, broadly speaking, say I'm a bit of a TikTok fan, but maybe the algorithm has just been kind to me. I can't, because TikTok strikes me as being the age-old, 200,000 years old human practice of people entertaining other people for the sheer pleasure of doing it. YouTube Premium, I think, is one of the greatest things to have happened in my entire lifetime. And there are other channels like Pinterest, very interestingly, which I don't think. The very interesting statistic about Pinterest is that they found at Pinterest that people scroll Pinterest at about the third of the speed that they scroll everything else.
Really?
So it is actually a kind of, how would you describe it?
Qualitative scroll?
In other words, it's driven by pleasure, not desperation.
Yeah. It's an enabling. I love Pinterest as well for similar reasons. And I'm actively courting them at the moment to join the Alliance because they enable real world hobbies and pleasures, whether that's interior design or fashion or fitness or exercise, and this is where it's really important to make that distinction. So much of what I scroll, I love. I get a huge amount of inspiration from it, and because I've curated who I follow, whose opinions I respect, but then suddenly 3 hours has gone.
Yeah.
And it's almost like junk. It disappears almost as quickly as it's come into my head. And I think, well, how have I just wasted 2.5 hours of my life in doing that? And it's not just that, it's what it's doing to our attention and our focus. So my two biggest concerns, the time opportunity cost, which is a business model. It is a business model thing, the attention economy.
Yes, it is.
And it's entirely that because it's predicated on mining for attention. It's the attention, it's the time, and then it's our ability to focus and concentrate. This is profoundly worrying. And I say this as a 40-something woman who's grown up without this technology, whose brain does this now. I've got about 63 open tabs on my laptop at the moment because I can't finish a PDF report anymore. Yeah. I'll open up something, and if it's longer than about 4 pages, I'll start it, and then I'll go, I'll come back to it because something's pinged, or I've got to do this, and I'm multitasking, and I'm checking everything. And if that's happening to me,
what is it doing?
Somebody who has managed to harness their attention to get degrees and read long-form books, and even in a book now, I really struggle. I'm very actively going back to old literature to try and brain train myself back into focus. Longer, more in-depth language and old-fashioned
my interesting
writing.
AI theory is that AI could solve the problem by effectively getting rid of those switching costs. I think in algorithm design, it's called a switching cost, that once you switch from one process to another, there's fundamentally a cost in terms of energy, time, all manner of kind of mental things. And apparently it's true of computers as it is true of humans.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as, for example, now where AI could help, it is a fucking abomination that my email app is a different app from my calendar app. Okay, I want a single app that answers the question, what should I do right now? Okay?
Claude's doing that now.
The fact that I have to look at an email, then look back at a calendar, then go back to the email because I've forgotten the fucking date, all right? Then go back to a calendar is just simply ludicrous, right? I mean, now, a very classic example of this is the human ability consciously to consciously do two things at once is basically zero. That's the miracle of intuition and all of those unconscious processes is we can actually resolve simultaneously, incommensurable things to arrive at a decision. Whereas consciously you can only look at one thing at a time. And I always think the perfect example of this, I know I bore people with this, the London Overground, where they simply added it to the tube map, right? Now, if you think about it as a nice analogy, making a journey from two maps, planning a journey would be almost impossible, right? Let's imagine you had a rail map and you had a tube map, and you had to refer between the two to work out what mixture of train and tube you should use to get from, I don't know, Richmond to Stratford. Okay? Be a total mindfuck.
Yeah. That's what's happening right now.
If you put the things on one map,
yeah,
then you can, in a very short period of time, you can very rapidly see what needs to be done. And I think there's this appalling kind of Swiss Army knife mess, which is the smartphone, which is, it's effectively, it has 17 different things. And maybe it's better in China, where they seem to have this one app that does everything. If I'm right, there's this one bloody app in China where you book a taxi, find a wife, do your banking. Okay, so whatever. Or, all within the space of an afternoon. But the mess of the Swiss Army knife, which effectively has. Someone said of a Swiss Army knife, it has, 17 different implements, none of which is particularly good at the task in hand. And I'm convinced that, what I want my calendar stroke email to do is to block out time in my calendar to read the email with the most urgent ones first.
Yeah. And the funny thing is
it's the same thing. It's an answer to, they're two devices in an answer to one question. The fact now that when you log in to read your gas bill, you then have to do two-factor authentication. So the ludicrous business where 3 apps are involved in a single task. And this the reason I'm saying this is it's partly a rant, but it's partly an analogy for the fact that this shit isn't very well designed, actually.
Of course.
It's not really designed around a human need or objective. It's designed around a technological capability, and it falls to us to string it all together.
I totally agree. And I think the original point was that could AI help correct some of this stuff? And I think it will make life more efficient and it will streamline. But that's I think it's solving for those are all different problems than the problems that the attention economy has created.
Your fundamental problem, by the way, the opportunity cost problem and the secondary one. But the opportunity cost, of course, is all the more important to focus on because opportunity costs are invisible. Because we're never conscious of what it was we could have done. And, maybe we're even optimized to minimize our perception of them because we don't like regret very much.
Yeah.
But it's the old phrase, no one ever lay on their deathbed and said, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. There's a phrase.
On Instagram.
Or Instagram. But it's the same principle, which is when you look, there is a kind of reframing there. When you look back on your life, if there was a meter which showed the percentage of time you spent.
Or wasted.
Effectively wasted, which could have been something else.
Well, there was a lovely Polaroid campaign that lit up New York over the summer, which had those, no one will ever wish they spent more time. And another one was AI can never help you feel the sand between your toes.
Yeah.
I think tech has to get better, and it does already make our lives much, much more efficient. So this is why I'm a lover of technology, and why, controversially, apparently in my circles, my 12-year-old has a smartphone.
Yeah.
Because I know safe tech for kids. So his phone, he's got calls, texts, his Go Henry card, Google Maps. It's like a really cool app for kids where you can budget and he can pay for things.
Life 360, so you can track
him.
His
money.
Have you got Life 360?
I haven't got that.
I
will look into that.
Wow.
And it's got Spotify because he loves music, and I really want to empower that love of music.
He's listening to Bottleneck right now.
Is it live? I didn't realise it was live.
This would be on the outside of my flip phone.
Right.
See, those things which are actually useful things, which, let's face it, we all carried with us before we had, you might have had a Walkman or whatever back in the day, but there was, and I think that awful thing, which is you have to leave the house with nothing or with everything, is a bloody catastrophe.
I totally agree. So his is an enabling phone. That's the point. And as and when he gets older and there are apps that he wants, we can have a conversation by conversation. Well, if he loves chess, I don't have a problem with him playing chess. It's great brain training, and it's a nice way. Or the Kindle app. If he likes reading digitally, I don't have a problem with that. But the point is, he's not going to have a time and attention and focus zap on his device anytime soon until he's old enough to be able to understand what he's engaging with and until he's a little bit more resilient. So yes, technology is one solution. I guess the solution, and whether it's a solution, that might be a bit optimistic to call it such, but the other thing that I think is really important is how the culture needs to shift around our perception of technology. And that's very much what we're seeking to do with Scroll Aware. The mission, in a nutshell, is how do we make analog cool again?
Yeah. Like Christopher
because
Nolan.
It is cool. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And Gen Z is a really interesting generation to watch right now. Because, there's all these...
My daughter asked for a gramophone player.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to say, having spent, I was born in 1965, and finally we reached this wonderful apotheosis of music where you could carry a small device and listen to anything she wanted. And she wanted fucking vinyl. Now, this to me was an act of pure Luddism. I did buy her the bloody thing, but to me it was incomprehensible, by the way. I might add that.
It's because there's this word, have you heard of it? Ammonia? And it means, I've probably mispronounced
it. Is it Durkheimian anomie as a concept in sociology, which is a sort of almost a kind of lack of feel? No, it's not
I'm
that
going to
one.
stop you there.
Okay.
Ammonia, Greek word, and I believe it means nostalgia for a world you've never known. Which is lovely.
That is so deep.
Yes. And it's Gen Z basically saying, hang on, we missed out on our childhoods.
Yeah.
They're watching Friends.
I see that.
All this nostalgia is coming back.
Even the music is like
a world before phones. There was this big video on TikTok of a graduation ceremony that somebody had filmed on one of these hand cams in the late 90s. And all these kids shared it on TikTok going, oh my God, I'm so jealous. I wish that had been my high school, because look at them. They're all walking around, chatting, dancing in the corner, to music, and there was not a single phone on display. And that's what's driving this move towards nostalgia, apparently, although the marketers blame your industry. Apparently it's nostalgia now. We need a new word for it.
Oh, it's nostalgia.
Yeah, nostalgia. There's a new word for it. And 53% of Gen Z recently said that they support a social media ban for under 16s.
Yeah.
And that's literally the generation just below them, because they're saying we lost our childhood.
Yeah.
So there's this growing move of digital defiance, unplugged events and concerts that people will go to, and parties where the kids themselves, or young people, I should say, obviously Gen Z a bit older, where they're saying no phones, not having it. We're reclaiming our brains. And I think that's a really positive movement to start thinking about this sort of scroll to soul ratio and really investing in the moments and your own moments as opposed to watching other people's moments. And that's what we've lost with the seesaw, having gone so far into scroll. And, all I think that needs to happen is a movement towards intentionality. Really thinking, stopping, a few scroll-free zones appearing within coffee shops, it becoming actually really uncool to have your phone out.
Hey, I'm doing it for notes.
Yeah. When you're out with your girls or when you're having a meal, these are just little shifts that happen. No family meal is there an excuse for the phone to be at the table
100%.
at all. If you're out with your girls, or with your friends, if you're in a work meeting where you're seriously trying to be creative and go deep and focus, put them away.
Yeah.
We need to train our brains into knowing the phone as the bridge and the enabler, versus allowing it to become this constant distraction at all times. And I think that's a very simple shift, and you can have a lot of fun with that shift as well, because there are so many antidotes in the real world that we can sell and promote.
I mean, there are good little tech hacks like make sure your email only polls the server every hour, turn off all notifications apart from super urgent ones. I mean, they should be turned off by default, actually, And, there are one or two things where it might be useful to have notifications. Everything else is a complete shit show as far as I'm concerned.
Well, going back to what you were saying about Gen Z terminology, the word NPC gets used a lot, right? Non-playing characters, for those that don't know. And whenever you go onto like the tube in London, for example, as soon as I get into the tube, it gets really quiet and everybody's on their phones and no one's having a conversation. I see that I do this experiment on myself, right?
The non-playing character is like the kind of wizard that isn't a person, but it's just generated by the game to sort of stand around and do weird wizardy things.
Or in an action film when the guy's being shot at doesn't die and then everybody else is dying. And it's almost like they're insignificant, but whatever. Yes. So I guess like what you see there is I do this experiment on myself when I go into an Uber, right? My experience is completely different when I go into the Uber and go straight onto my phone, or whether I go into the Uber, put my phone away and then have a conversation with the person, right? That could change the trajectory of the day and the opportunity and their day, right? And often than not, you actually build a connection with somebody, right? And they always talk about the fact that in a world where we have all the tools to connect us, we've never been more alone than ever. I think they're calling it the lonely epidemic, right? But then going back to what you said, and I was noting this down about time, attention, and focus. The other thing that people don't actually realize is the subconscious messaging that's actually going on in your brain. The amount of times I've seen somebody scroll through TikTok, I'm listening to the words that are being said. And then they'll be like, oh, we need to go get some food in this place. And they don't know where the thought came from, right? Yeah. And they don't realize that they're priming their brains with micro messaging that they don't even control. And that's when things get really, really interesting, from the anxiety that's forming to the fact that people all want these things. They don't even know why they want it. So it's like, there's like a quadruple factor there, right? That people are not even paying attention to. And I guess the flywheel or the butterfly effect of this is going to be catastrophic if you don't realize it.
I love the non-playing character reference, which I only heard last week. And I thought, brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. And profoundly depressing.
Yeah.
Because the next great divide within society is going to be between that percentage of the population that has learnt to control their time, their focus and their attention, and those that haven't. And it will fall along socioeconomic lines as well. You know, it will entrench, I think, a lot of the inequalities that we're seeing at the moment. I mean, you only need to look at something like the smartphone-free childhood movement to see, you know, how professional parents, you know, centric it is, because, you know, those parents are tuning into those sorts of content. They're reading long form books by, you know, psychologists and educating themselves about this stuff in the way that, you know, a single mother that lives in inner city London doesn't have time to worry about everything that may or may not be on their child's device, or to understand the neuro-linguistic programming that's going on, you know, in terms of what they're reading. And obviously, the greatest barometer of that is the fact that the tech entrepreneurs themselves don't allow their own children to have these platforms, right? So, you know, our children, or those that are effectively being lobotomized by these technology platforms, are going to be ruled by the children of the tech entrepreneurs who have learned to foster their attention. Anyway, that's far too binary and extreme a view, because of course there's lots of graduation within it. But unless we recognize, you know, the risk we're doing, and I actually think talking to parents and adults about their own weaknesses is a much more compelling way to have the conversation about children's habits and behaviours than it is to simply go, ban the phone, stop them having it, take them away. It's not the phone. You know, it's the content and the dopamine and the addictive nature of what's on the phone. That's the problem. And I do believe kids are growing up in this world, hence them, as my son is, getting to grips with each aspect of the Swiss Army knife as and when, you know, he needs it to enable his independence. That's what I use it for. I want him. I believe in free range parenting. You know, I dropped my 10 and 12-year-old off in a town 4 miles away yesterday. I went, good luck. See if you can get home. And they did. You know, they found a bus timetable. They didn't have a debit card, so, you know, they couldn't do it. They had £10 each and they managed to find their way home. And they came home a foot taller. You know?
Yeah.
Because our generation doesn't parent like that anymore. We properly overprotect and coddle and think there's danger around every corner. And that was the part of Jonathan's book, Jonathan Haidt, that never gets talked about. It's all the phone end that gets talked about.
Yeah.
But
not
the other sort of
parenting
slightly
culture.
riskier behaviour.
Well, just the fact that we can't just take the phone away without also opening up their physical worlds more, allowing them more freedom, allowing them to get out and do things. And there being spaces for children to do that. And that's the other problem. And something I would love to address with Scrollaware is there's no alternatives to the phone.
Yeah.
The only place for young people to go to now is, Burger King and McDonald's and KFC and Wingstop. That's doing really well these days.
I think the hot honey ones are the best. By the way, just a little tip.
I like Wingstop.
Yeah.
But
we need third spaces. We need more investments in the communities because the communities have declined. The high streets declined.
Community centres.
Churches, aren't nearly as packed as they used to be. Nightclubs are closing, like 10% or something last year closed. Pubs are closing. It's tragic. And I would love to see this, the real lives of people, both your staff and your customers, becoming the next CSR agenda for business, because it will ultimately solve a lot of the problems that CSR does already. It's looking at inequality within society. It's looking at mental health, people's mental health. It's all related. And if we can turn intentional tech use into the next big CSR agenda and start to see companies investing in the infrastructure of the communities in which their people and customers live. So that every grassroots football team doesn't have to scrabble around for a local pub to sponsor their kit. Instead, Nike comes in, or Gymshark comes in, and L'Oreal comes in and sponsors drama clubs for kids, and sort of anything grassroots in a community. Let's see business and communities working together to plug that gap in funding that exists in local communities.
It's worth noting you mentioned an opportunity cost, and we don't know what physical real-world technologies would now exist if there wasn't an extraordinarily overinvestment of speculative capital in information technology.
Yeah, it's
grotesquely. We'd be flying around in single-person drones by now. But the extraordinary thing was, in a way, that there were two things. There was the opportunity to capture network effects online, combined with the fact that it was comparatively unregulated, so you could do things very fast. Whereas if you try and do something in the real world, the regulatory and other hurdles are immense. And so there is a fair point, which is, will we look back in 50, 60, 70 years' time and go, rather like, I suppose the Victorians had a period where they were disproportionately obsessed with railways. Will we look at this and go, actually, this was, in a sense, a completely imbalanced way to invest our speculative capital?
I was going to say that I have this weird take on AI. When we talked about, can AI solve this? I don't think it's going to do it in a front-facing way. I think that every time I see headlines about jobs being cut because of AI or efficiencies, a lot of the times it's work that's happening in the digital space. So I'm thinking that AI is going to kick the humans out of the digital space and the digital jobs, and it's going to force us to look back in the real world and start to innovate where we live. Because right now, the digital space is advancing and getting better, but the real life world is almost like getting no love. But eventually, you're going to have this whole generation, and you're seeing this with a lot of young people. You could almost call them the COVID graduates, right? All of them are finding it very difficult to get into work. So what are they going to do? They're going to create in the real world, right? That's why there's this push for not being in technology. You're not in the matrix, if you will, right? So you have all these humans that are living on Earth, but they're all in the matrix, building the matrix, whereas you can't even get from one side of the US to the other on a train, right? There's no advancement happening in the real world. It's almost like we stopped and we're going backwards. So hopefully what AI will do, because people are getting pushed out of the matrix and now into the real world, is going to force innovation. Or what it's going to do is you're going to have people that have a vast appreciation for the arts, for humanity, for how we used to do things. And then you'll have some people that are like vastly on one end and the others that are vastly on the other end. And I think the CEO of NVIDIA said that the next billionaires are going to be plumbers and electricians, right? So because those skills are needed, right? Like you try to get me to change a pipe, I can't do it, right? No. But you tell me to build a brand or do this, et cetera, I can do that, right? And the other thing is, you talked about the role of brands. This is why my company and what we do is called community marketing. Actually, the best way for brands to grow is to do the work that the government used to do, right? Is create grassroots centers for people to connect. And if you think about the Gymshark store in Regent Street, the reason it was built was not to sell more gym clothes. It was to be the next Starbucks, the next Modern Tussauds, to be an area where people go to connect and bond over their love for fitness, right? Yeah. That role used to be played by someone else. Now brands have to play that role, right? Now influencers play that role. People like Mr. Beast play that role because it seems like that's now becoming like the spot for anybody that's looking to grow their business.
It's almost a tragedy, though, that they have to step into that because it suggests we've lost the appetite for communal consumption.
Yeah.
In other words, that bizarrely consumption has become increasingly individualistic. I mean, nearly all infrastructure spending in the United States significantly stopped in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
Road building, all the major projects, nothing much happened after that period. Mm-hmm. And, those things are it's always more time consuming to innovate in the real world because it requires the agreement of a lot of different disparate individuals before you can proceed. Mm-hmm. And I always remember this really interesting instance, which was in terms of, the future is unevenly distributed. There was a sort of Sunday Times photograph or something of someone in a kind of lower middle class Chinese household. And they had a sort of 65-inch flat screen TV and a satellite rigged up in the roof. But they shat in a hole in the garden, And I, from my British perspective, I thought slightly odd priorities. That you prioritise your satellite TV over sanitation. Then it occurred to me, one, of course, sanitation came first in the UK. There were, public drain projects long before there were satellite television. Yeah. But secondly, you can install a satellite TV without asking anybody else. Yeah. If you want to install public drainage, it requires an extraordinary amount of cooperation.
So that's the bottleneck.
And so, the bottleneck there is that we undoubtedly progress much faster in things which can be done individually than in things that require collective action. And the miracle of 19th century Britain, in a sense, was the extraordinary ability to do things, whether it was a postal service, the penny post or the railways, which were effectively collective achievements for collective benefit. And there's something there that I think is, it does worry me in a way that brands have to play this space because it seemed to happen from the bottom up.
Yeah.
50, 60, 70 years ago. Yeah. There was spontaneous coordinated action. With, the free, the voluntary cooperation and coordination of free people being the highest form of efficiency. And that talent seems to have deserted us.
Do you think that me and my co-founder have been having this conversation, and actually my dad is the one that first taught me that the best way to actually develop a country is via a benevolent dictatorship, right? Because then you have one person saying we're going to get this done and not look at HS2, right?
Yes.
That's something that everybody agreed is the right thing to do. But because you have to get so many people bought into it, it almost like stopped and stopped.
Well, it's literally billions spent before any track is laid.
Yeah.
Now if you contrast that with the speed at which the railways were built or whatever, in the 19th century, it's kind of painful.
It's terrifying. And the tube, I was just thinking about the tube.
There's a new tube line coming
how
out.
Quickly they built it and how long it's taken to do HS2. Oh, there's so much to unwrap in all of those comments. Have we lost community spirit is your question. Why do brands have to come into the fold? I mean, yes, both can be true, right? I think it's the right thing for brands to do, to bring people together in person. I went to a fabulous event at the Outernet, which is brilliant. It was all about events. And do you know Fabian Riggle, who was the founder of Secret Cinema?
I've heard of Secret Cinema.
He's just setting up a new venue in London called Lost, which is designed to be this labyrinthine place where you kind of disappear and there's pianos and corridors and you never know what you're going to get. Phones away as soon as you come in, and you're supposed to get lost in this place because it's an experience. But we live in this age where brands are thinking, or have been, I think, today, in very simplistic terms. How do we turn our events into Instagram content? And there's a whole industry of businesses that just build Instagrammable walls now
I know.
that you have to stand in front of before you go. And holidays, every beach now has got one of those swings so that you can take a picture and put it on your Instagram. Look, tick, I've been there, done that. Look at what an awesome life I have. I mean, people have said this for ages, but the sheer number of people watching concerts through their phones when they're in the concerts is so depressing, because they're never going to look back at it.
No.
And the most visionary people, and this is where I do feel optimism, because I think the tide is turning. The more and more people are saying, no, these are my memories. I'm capturing them here. And we can take a photo outside if we want to remember the fact that we're all here together. But, phones away, we're present. And you see Chris Martin, asking people, can everyone please, this one song, put your phone away and just be here in the moment. Live your memories. Don't just capture them to show off to other people.
Complained about this, by the way, because they said the whole business of crowd reaction, which used to be fundamental to your motivation in performing on stage. In other words, you're no longer playing to an audience, you're playing to cameras, and it's a completely different feeling.
Comedians, especially, because they couldn't test new material.
You see what you mean?
Of course. And that was the whole point, because it could be crap, and they're on camera actually being crap, and they're like, hang on.
They ban it when you go to a comedian show. Like, they literally put it away. And I also heard that a lot of the stage design now at concerts is actually built to almost like look good on the phone, because that's the best form of marketing for the concert itself, right? So getting people to go there to actually be like promo for the band, and then everybody else comes in to be more promo. No one actually goes there to experience it and be present and actually enjoy.
There was one of these milkshake chains where the milkshakes were not designed by the chef. They were basically designed by the marketing director to be Instagrammable rather than enjoyable, because how they looked were more important than how they tasted. And it is a kind of grotesque distortion, and it's really it's a horrible distortion, I think, caused by the fact I do kind of blame the phone, because I think it is, by being portable and by demanding you carry everything everywhere, which ironically is why EE is called EE, that everything everywhere is actually a bit of a pain in the arse, that there's a huge downside to this, because our lives were healthily compartmentalized by reality until that came along, including the internet, which was a thing you did at a particular place and time. And, when I started work, and I suddenly realized my young staff don't even have any memory of this, which is when you're in the photocopier room, you photocopied, and when you're in a meeting room, you had a meeting, and when you're at your desk, you did desk-like things, and then when you went to the pub afterwards, you had pub conversation. And they were all neatly compartmentalized by reality and kept watertight. And this thing has basically messed that up. I mean, it's that we forget the fact that we, to some extent, used place to achieve focus. Because when I am here, there is one thing I can do. And it is genuinely upsetting. I mean, there are other problems as well, which is probably, we talk about the scandalous content that is generated in order to get attention. So it's, wildly attention-seeking behavior. But there's an opposite problem, which is the mildly controversial has been completely frozen out. In other words, there are two opinions which make sense to hold in this world, which is a totally banal, politically correct, offensive to no one opinion, and then something which effectively earns you no opprobrium or censure whatsoever, or you can hold an absolutely outrageous opinion. So if you are mildly left-wing or right-wing, the same thing happens in advertising now, which is there's a census-wide report called The Voice of the CMO. And a huge number of CMOs say every time we produce a communication, we're basically worried about backlash because people will contrive all kinds of reasons to be offended. And they also think it's a massive limitation to creativity because you can't be mildly provocative anymore. You can only be boring or scandalous. And, you know, if you look at advertising, I mean, we mentioned Friends, that, you know, one of the reasons I think Gen Z are watching Friends is you couldn't make Friends today.
Yeah.
For all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
Okay. Because, you know, it would be subject to all kinds of censure. Peep Show. I was watching Peep Show. Another thing my daughter, who's 24, watches all the time. I don't think you can make that now. You know, you couldn't make Faulty Towers now. And, you know, I'm mildly worried about advertising. I'm actually more worried about comedy. Yeah. The fact that it's... Now, I'll give you an example of an advertisement. My brother had been in California. It's quite an interesting timeline. California in... So this chief marketing officer survey by Census Wide mentioned this fundamental fear that we can't actually be mildly interesting anymore. There are only two and both unattractive extreme positions. So my brother had been in California, which was already politically correct in 1993. It was already kind of consumed by this kind of anxiety about someone somewhere might be offended. And he was missing kind of British banter. And he came back, and I dated exactly, because it would have been, I guess, 1993 or something, shortly after the death of Robert Maxwell. And he suddenly found himself on the tube convulsed in laughter because there was an ad for The Sun on the tube opposite. And this was during the price war between The Sun and the Daily Mirror. And The Sun was still at 10p and the Daily Mirror was at 30p. And the ad for The Sun simply said, the Daily Mirror now costs 30p. Don't go overboard to buy it. This was shortly after the proprietor of the Daily Mirror had basically fallen or jumped off his yacht to his own death. Okay. And my brother had felt so deprived of this kind of badinage and mischief in California that he kind of had this moment of like, I'm home again.
Yeah.
Now, it suddenly occurred to me you couldn't do that here now.
Yeah.
You know, nothing, you know, some bereavement group. In other words, there are a lot of organisations which effectively confect offence or outrage for their own purposes. And it's having a majorly problematic effect, I think, on discourse, because what we want our children to be exposed to is, you know, mildly contentious opinions.
Absolutely.
And what a university should be is, it shouldn't be Jordan Peterson and, Andrew Tate all the time. They have their place, I'm sure, okay? But you should at least expose people to opinions that are mildly discomforting. Okay. And yet that content it's very, very difficult to generate that content because, as I said, you're always drawn towards one of two bizarre extremes. It's
the business model. That's what the attention of business model is. It's in their business interest to keep us outraged and or affirmed in our opinions, which is why the attention economy has to, by default, set up a view of the world as a battle between good and evil people.
Of course.
And that's what it is. And of course, that line runs through the middle of each and every one of us, and if you think that you can understand Middle Eastern politics on the basis of a 3-minute TikTok video, you've got a problem. And yet there's people marching that have done that, that don't know which river and don't know which sea, and that's just one example. And it's profoundly worrying. I mean, one of the solutions that I've tapped into is, basically media literacy. And actually doing that work with children to understand it's complicated stuff, right? Though the motivations of the creator, and where you get your content from. And in the media and advertising world, there was a great debate that I was at last week about the efficacy of quality media buy versus social media media buy. And apparently there's something like 15% wastage when you buy social media ad spend, and the effectiveness of sitting your adverts next to quality journalism and
context affects conviction effectively, and the extent to which to some extent I would argue that the digital media world has been desperate to commoditize everything, and the metrics of marketing have been to some extent hacked by the people like Meta and Alphabet.
They mark their own homework,
okay? And, they've managed to infect with this idea of efficiency the whole judgment of, what effective marketing is, and reduced it to a kind of bizarre competition to throw money at $2 trillion companies. I think we should hold ourselves responsible for this, because I think it's been. I mean, having said that, okay, the clients themselves would much prefer to have numerical comparable metrics than to actually engage in any kind of subjective decision making.
But if the metrics are there, which they are,
and
the CSR is there.
Yes,
I that's when
agree.
This becomes a really interesting table that the brand should all be sat at.
Well, the other interesting finding, if you think about it, is that influencer marketing is extraordinarily effective. And it occurred to me that's because influencer marketing is to some extent the opposite of what performance marketing has done. It lasts for a long time. The effects really endure. It has real humans and appears within a contextual setting. And so, it's everything which the other form of digital advertising isn't. So we shouldn't be really surprised by its success, because it's filling a void, I think.
But what's going to be really interesting, though, is that Meta have just announced that they will soon be allowing people to opt out of ads and allow them to pay £4 a month. I think it's £3.99 a month to have a YouTube Premium X experience, right?
Interesting.
Right, where they don't get any ads. So what's going to happen?
I might go back on the platform at that point, and this is weird from someone working in advertising, because if they can stop doing that thing where they go, so-and-so's just posted, and I have no idea from the email whether it's because a child has died or because their daughter has just baked a cake, okay, and I am forced to go to Facebook to find out, okay, if they can actually get themselves back into the provision of consumer value and away from this absolutely maniacal focus on hacking attention, then I'm back in there. I mean, I pay for Kaggy.com, which is a paid for search engine, because I no longer trust Google to be in the business of telling me what I want to know, rather than in the business of telling me what someone else wants me to know. And I've had enough bad experiences where you end up paying $60 for that Canadian Ester, whatever it's called, the Canadian equivalent of an Ester. Okay. Well, the top search result is basically a company that sells you something that should cost 14 Canadian dollars for 60. Well, unsurprisingly, the dishonest actor can outbid the honest actor, in this case, the Canadian government, in effectively reaching the top of the search rankings. Now, I'm sorry, if you're $1 trillion company packed with Stanford's PhDs, someone should have clocked this. That we have an auction mechanism which will undoubtedly privilege whoever is the highest margin or least honest actor in the marketplace. Now, my argument is this isn't rocket science. This is basic economics, and someone should have been alert to this. And so this enshittification problem is really, really acute, I think.
I think what's going to be interesting, though, going back to the argument about the fact that currently influencer marketing is human and paid media is robotic.
Correct.
Now that paid media's effectiveness will start to go down, will advertisers put all their money on creators and turn them robotic? Because marketers are in everything, right?
The other thing, though, that worries me, I actually don't think paying a premium for ads is going to solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the attention economy, because the ads don't kind of... they don't polarize you. They don't addict you. They're not designed to be addictive. How effective they are as a result, I don't know. Some are. I mean, I bought half my Christmas presents based on Instagram advertising, but
as the engagement that you put in and the increased value that has for the advertisers, does that reduce? Because they're not trying to get you to engage. Because
the business model of the business completely changes if it's a subscription model. I mean, it's interesting to see the popularity of the paper publications like The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Week, etc., The Economist, which are, because they're predominantly read by subscribers, their motivation is to reward the reader rather than to hack attention.
Right.
Because the attention is already a given. These are the people who subscribe. They're extremely successful. I mean, I asked Michael Gove, who edits The Spectator, if you close down every single digital part of the publication, would you survive? Oh, yeah, they'd still make money as a paper publication. And one of the interesting things is, and this was a marketing a person at the FT who first made this point, which is if most of our readers are subscribers, we have to focus much more
Quality.
on effectively, because we can take their attention, or at least their money, as a given, okay? And our incentive then is to keep them as subscribers by being as long-term rewarding as possible. So I would really miss having that on the mat on Saturday. Whereas if you have an advertiser-funded model, effectively, the advertiser isn't really appraised of the mood the person's in when they're exposed to the message. And so anything you can do to garner attention is sort of fair game. And of course, that will end up with your race to the bottom.
That's interesting.
I mean, essentially, it's sort of you get what you pay for. And I would argue that, and I think if we're going to be really happy about this, a world where we pay for this stuff, it's very difficult psychologically to get people to pay for something they're used to having free.
Exactly.
Yeah,
extremely difficult.
And cynically, I wonder whether, having learnt the lessons of attention, why wouldn't they just keep both? If they've got premium, if people aren't complaining themselves about the attention. I mean, and let's be honest, creators do this for themselves. It'd be interesting to see, how as this podcast takes off, what you learn about algorithmically, what is the most effective reel that you'll put out. Because I've noticed so many of these creators that I've really enjoyed become extreme versions of themselves.
100%.
It's called content capture, right? Audience capture.
Yeah.
And they play the game now. They've all got you'll never guess what this person said, and the clickbait is. And I just think, oh, what a shame! I loved you because you were so nuanced, and now you're getting on more and more extreme guests. You're playing that clickbait game, and I'm susceptible to it. I do click on it, and I just think I didn't want to click on that, and it's not actually a good representation of what your whole podcast was about in that moment. It's cynical, but it's playing the clicks game.
I was on a podcast where the headline completely misrepresented my opinion.
I bet I know which one that was.
I had to get it taken. I've got it taken down because I said at no point in this podcast did I say anything that was in any way equivalent to the quote you'd attributed to me, but it was simply optimized for again anger. Really.
And so one of the reasons why when I was speaking to Rory about this podcast was exactly that. We said everything is about, we want to know people, but then we want to be able to have almost like discussions about things that are actually happening in the world. And we want to do it not in a way to kind of like bait people out or to try to get people to seem as extreme. We actually want to humanize everybody, right? It's almost like the space where you get the opportunity to speak. You're allowed to speak your mind, and we have a human discussion around topics. I think a lot of the time, especially in this world, as soon as somebody doesn't align with your opinion, you almost like shun them to one side, whereas really what you should be able to do. And one thing that I learned really early on was the fact that I should be able to sit next to somebody that has a completely different opinion to myself, but I can hear them out and try to understand why they think that way. And I think that actually the human bottleneck that's happening in society right now is that people don't even give each other the courtesy to do that, right?
We always did that in pubs. I mean, a standard pub table would have around it people with opinions verging from fanatical Marxists to rabid right wingers. Okay. And they accommodated each other. Partly because each of the people, particularly those with extreme opinions, knew that there was a limit to how much you could bang on before you became boring.
Yeah.
But of course, when you can effectively, one, find a completely receptive audience, or secondly, you can continually find new people to bore.
Yeah.
The usual constraints on being a kind of single issue fanatic, which were simply social censure, no longer really applied. Another one that interests me fascinatingly is trolling. People who just go online and are just randomly rude with no constructive point to be made whatsoever. Yeah. By the way, I wouldn't see any objection to taking that content down because it's worthless. Okay. If it's just a gratuitous insult, I don't think it falls under free speech. It's pointless. But very interesting thing. In the 18th century in London, the people who travelled along the river on the riverboats routinely used to shout abuse at people on the bank, just random abuse.
Yeah.
Okay, and they just shout wanker, fatso, whatever it might be. And we know this from Boswell's Life of Johnson.
And
the reason was, if you think about it, you had, in order to do that, to abuse someone without the risk of consequences. Okay, there were very, very few situations. You know that Monty Python scene, your mother was a hamster, or your father was a hamster and your mother smells of elderberries. You can do that because you're in the wall of a castle and no one can get at you.
Yeah.
Okay, there weren't many situations where taunting was possible because either you were in a small community where people knew who you were, so they'd bump into you again and then beat you up.
Yeah.
Or, in a large city, they could come after you and beat you up. But if you're in a city of 1 million people, which was London in the 18th century, and you were on a boat in the river, there was no way they could get to you.
Yeah.
So there's this awful, terrifying thing which occurs to me about human nature, which is it's somehow in our nature, when it was rare to be able to abuse people, that was our natural instinct. Yeah, there were these rare occasions where you could abuse people without consequences, and we naturally found that amusing. And then you end up with, for example, anonymity online. I mean, there are various people, I think Scott Galloway makes the point, which is, you kind of have the right to free speech, but not to do it anonymously.
Yeah.
They've always been anonymous. Graffiti was an anonymous, vehicle. But the extent to which people can just drift around anonymously in this world without any effectively reputational consequences attached to their actions, that's a stretch on free speech.
Yeah, and what you get then is...
in other words, you have an absolutely right to say what you like, but you do live with the consequences of what you say. But that ability and the temptation that then comes across, effectively just to turn yourself into a mindless abuse engine. It's not something we evolved to cope with. That's all I'm saying. Whereas we have evolved all kinds of mechanisms for dealing with ourselves in non-anonymous groups of 150 people. Those are self-policing to a large extent, as are smaller online communities, of course. They're self-policing and perfectly amicable.
Yeah, when you look at platforms like LinkedIn, for example, there's 1 billion users on the platform, but only 1% of the people on the platform actually engage or post, right? Well, I think it's 40% of the people actively engage with posts on LinkedIn, but only 1% actually create. It's because of that very reason. Not only is your name there, your picture there, your job's there, right? So you're a little bit more conscious about what it is that you put out there because there's consequences, right? It's not like you're driving in New York and you can yell at the person and then keep driving because everybody's just yelling at people.
Yes.
It's almost like you're at the stop, right? And people know who you are.
Exactly.
And if you really want to say something, it's because you actually mean it, right?
When I go down to East Kent, far enough away from London, if you're driving along next to a row of parked cars and someone waits for you and you don't give them a wave of thanks, that's a pretty major social infraction. So levels of politeness and general sort of concern for each other undoubtedly seem to correlate to degree. In other words, the likelihood that... I'll tell you something. I used to travel in first class by train from Sevenoaks on the train. Okay, you would never see anybody who boarded at Sevenoaks or Tunbridge Wells sitting in a first class seat without a first class ticket, because if they got called out, it was a matter of social embarrassment. Someone on the train would know who they were. Once you got to Orpington or Bromley South or something, all bets were off. Okay, because you'd reach that level of population density where nobody expected to encounter anybody ever again.
Yeah.
And so, we're not really designed for worlds. I include big cities in this. We're not really designed for worlds in which we don't expect to meet the same people more than once.
Yeah.
And it always struck me as there was also a friend I had who used to travel to Petersfield. I think there was one train a day on Southwestern which didn't stop until Petersfield.
Yeah.
And the people who lived in Petersfield or beyond loved that train because the level of courtesy and kind of deference to each other on that train, because it didn't stop anywhere with a high density population, was just delightful. It was kind of like some sort of, it was like the railway children. It was a charming old fashioned train atmosphere. And so, there are, we've undoubtedly suddenly exposed ourselves to effectively not just an information environment, but a social environment to which our evolved brains have left us completely unprepared. And, you're absolutely right to say I mean, we have to. You're right also to be healthily ambiguous about this, because I'm always, I always make this point that it's very easy to want to black hat, white hat everything, and if you take something like Airbnb. Well, there are areas where I think Airbnb is absolutely wonderful. There's some farmer who's got some crappy outbuilding, which you can turn into a source of revenue and people can spend the weekend there and it's all wonderful. And then you go to Barcelona and you kind of go, it's more profitable to rent a 2-bedroom apartment for 9 weekends of the year to Airbnbers than it is to actually rent it as a full-time residence to a local Barcelonan. And you go, that's actually kind of shit, isn't it? That's actually, and then you go to Barcelona and effectively all it is people wheeling suitcases through the streets to go to their various Airbnbs. And so, this is the interesting thing. Now, maybe we can use technology to, we can ultimately start to self-correct. But I think the problem we've got is that, weirdly, although I'm, politically to the right of most people at my office, they're much more naive in their enthusiasm for free market capitalism than I am in some respects, in that, it's automatically assumed that the perfect purpose of a company is to reward its shareholders, which I don't accept, in fact. And in fact, I think the companies that pursue that route aren't actually very good at rewarding their shareholders in the long term, because they tend to neglect their customers
as a consequence
of that. And so, 10, 15, 20, 40 years ago, everybody in television, in advertising, etc., would have moral discussions about the consequences of what they did. And what free market economics has created is a kind of very narrow utilitarianism, which effectively makes it possible to sort of justify more or less any self-interested position you hold. And David Ogilvy didn't believe, he thought that billboards were immoral. So they're the most prominent advertising person in the 1950s and beyond until the 70s. And his argument was they broke the contract with the public, because if you advertised on television or if you advertised in the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever, you were funding the surrounding content. So everybody won. The advertiser benefited, the consumer benefited, the publication benefited. It was part of a kind of benign feedback loop, which was, essentially a win-win for all three parties. He argued that the billboard benefited the landowner and it might have benefited the advertiser, but to the detriment of the passers-by who had to cope with an uglier environment because of the billboard. Now, you could actually, digital billboards you can make useful, by the way, technologically. You can have weather forecasts and tube information in amongst the ads. So you might argue that a digital billboard could actually, meet David Ogilvy's moral criteria, certainly if it's a bus shelter or something, rather than the middle of an area of outstanding beauty. But nobody really has. Part of the problem of the, of sort of neoliberal consensus is that nobody really has these moral discussions anymore about the second order consequences of the things they do.
We need a chief philosophy officer, particularly in these AI companies. The ability to actually think through the ramifications of where these models would go. I'd like to give the attention economy the benefit of the doubt that they didn't intend to become the addiction economy. The more that this evidence comes out and the more we see our most base human behaviors monetized, and the proof continues to mount up and up and up as to what it's doing to loneliness and mental health and anxiety and sleep deprivation and polarization, and then
I think I think it's mostly unintentional in a sense, but what happens with a large company is you compartmentalize it. And everybody's responsible for their own narrow part of the whole. And when you get a whole bunch of people optimizing the parts, the whole can turn toxic. So it is a problem that other than the CEO and maybe 2 or 3 people, there's no one there who's rewarded for taking the holistic view of what this business is about and what it does, because everybody else has their own little weird. I'll give you a lovely example. Someone who does retail advertising was asked to stop advertising because it was very successfully selling premium dog food. And they said, well, you've just told us it's very... And he said, I know, but I'm bonused on margin, not on profit. And the margin on our own brand dog food is higher than on the premium dog food as a percentage. Consequently, I get a bigger bonus if we sell a lot of low-priced low profit but high percentage margin own brand dog food. Whereas if we sell the premium dog food, every single case is
out.
so you literally end up with these utterly stupid forms of gamification of the system, and it's all a product of this idea that you have to effectively construct a company from individual parts. I mean, I've argued about online retailers for ages that they would sell a lot more if they gave people a choice of who delivered. Because people have strong preferences. Some people have strong aversions. People like to know. Sometimes I'd pay Amazon an extra £1 just to put the fucking thing in the post. If I'm ordering a USB cable, I don't want a van coming up the drive, just to deliver it. It's not really zen, as the postman's coming anyway. Might as well drop it off. And yet, because that decision is taken by a procurement function within the company, which is principally motivated by the amount of discount it can negotiate, and would not be rewarded by the fact that you had 20% more customers as a consequence of this decision, you end up with this fundamental thing of things that are micro-rational but macro-stupid. And companies are becoming, and of course, very, very large companies, effectively, these individual silos run away with their own daft metrics. And so a lot of it, there's someone there who is basically, incentivized on the basis of attention, who has no concern whatsoever as part of their job description for the quality of the attention or the mood the person's in while that attention is actually being earned.
I think the conversation needs to be had much more seriously. And I think the one part of society that's not at the table to have that conversation, bringing it back to why I'm here, is, how do we bring the brands and famous individuals together to have a seat at the table and say, look, what can we do about this? How far are we responsible, or can we help drive a more healthy way of living our lives, where we sell the benefits of community. We just fell down that rabbit hole around, polarization and the lack of mixing and trolling online. The antidote to that is people colliding more and making more eye contact in the real world, and I think that is an antidote. I think more sport is an antidote, more art and culture is an antidote, more events is an antidote, hobbies. And the irony is that so many advertisers and brands in the world are selling embodied real world experiences, right? They're selling venues, they're selling...
Well, live music is an extraordinary phenomenon. Yeah.
Live music, events, food and drink, hospitality, sporting goods.
Travel and leisure,
These are all products designed to be enjoyed in company, or in place in the real world. And yet the brands are spending 60 to 70% of their marketing budget to keep people further addicted for 3 to 4 hours in these platforms. Now,
you could actually, if you describe the problems of the modern world, excluding things like war, famine, etc., not my area of specialism, a large part of it is two things. It's that the cost of property and real estate soaks up too much of our discretionary income, and screens soak up too much of our discretionary time. If you could find a solution to those two things.
Well, I think the point where the brands are concerned is not to scare them and say, stop spending, stop buying your media there. No one's an idiot. There's great content there. It's where the eyeballs are. There's great engagement. There's great relevancy. But there is a question to say, well, come together and let's talk about what responsible looks like. Let's talk about, how we can drive trusted media and work with them as advertisers. Perhaps we can start putting end screens, around our content that say, now get offline and do, or take a break, almost like the drink responsibly campaign, because everything is fine in moderation. It's addiction that we need to watch for and create more boundaries and breaks around. And it's just boundaries and breaks. But it's not bans.
It is difficult to recreate the kind of Jonathan Haidt acceptance of risk in childhood, that your child would come home having fallen out of a tree. I mean, what was weird is that when I was about 9 or 10, I'd cycle 8 miles to Monmouth to see my grandmother. When I was about 15, my parents couldn't believe that they allowed me to do it. And that was, in the space of about 5 or 6 years. That there were things I did I used to climb up on the roof of the house and just sit on the apex roof, climb out of a skylight, and barefoot and just climb and just scuttle all over the roof. Okay, this was literally when I was like 8 or 9. My parents didn't know I was doing it, admittedly. Okay, but they wouldn't have had an absolute heebie-jeebie fit if they'd known I was doing it. They was just accepted that and that seemed to happen, and we don't quite know why. But of course, it's very difficult because the level of blame you're exposed to. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. That previously, if something bad happened to your kid, the default mode would be sympathy.
Yeah.
And now it's blame.
You're a bad parent.
You're a bad parent. And of course, the fewer people who allow their children to run around in the streets, the vastly more at risk those people are.
There's a lot of arguments, though, that parents are waking up to. The fact that the paedophiles are not on the street, they're all on the internet. The overprotection in the real world versus the underprotection in the online world is absolutely paramount. And there's statistics like you'd have to leave your child outdoors on their own for 150,000 years for them to be abducted.
Yes, I know. No, I know.
But statistics are no good when we live in a doom economy and one abduction is wall-to-wall coverage for 3 months. And I think it was Jonathan who wrote in his previous book the fact that it started in the 80s because they would put missing children on milk cartons. And you think, what a brilliant idea. You can publicise children that are missing.
Yeah.
But it put the prospect of children being abducted on
thing.
every breakfast table in America overnight, and suddenly kids stopped being allowed out. And that was around the time that we started to get news channels where obviously to fill their schedules they follow these stories and so we lived in this heightened sense of, it was called the doom economy, and that happened even before social media, and social media has now recognized that the doom economy really works, so that we put more and more of the doom into social media, so we have this very, very warped sense of the safety of the world that we live in, whereas the statistics are minuscule and negligible, and parenting has changed massively. But I'm having a lot of conversations with my generation of parents who do overparent massively about these sorts of things, and I'm arranging.
How frightened were you when you dropped your children off 5 miles from home with 10 quid each and told them to work out how to get their own way home?
I was a little anxious, but I've been trying more and more of these experiments because I'm very familiar with the data on it. And I have to say, the fact that my eldest has a phone gave me a lot of reassurance. So this is where the phone actually plays into these opportunities and trends.
Do you ever find my... On the
well,
iPhone,
I knew that he could, and this is what parents are asking even on dumb phones. They said, we would get a dumb phone, but we want tracking.
Yeah.
And actually, I think that's a good technology.
Yes, I think tracking is really good technology.
It's peace of mind to know where they are. And the fact that, he's got to go Henry means worst case scenario, he can get on the bus.
Also, by the way, it means you need to ring them up much less.
Yeah.
Because you can basically interpret where they are and what they're doing. And if you need to go and fetch them, you don't have to have 5 coordinating phone calls about where they happen to be, which was usually all bar one in Tunbridge Wells in my experience. And actually, I think there's also an interesting point which someone needs to make, which is these kids are going to leave home. They're going to go to university.
Absolutely.
And in my experience, it was their most helicoptered children who went most catastrophically off the rails.
Of course.
Because in a sense, you haven't actually learned boundaries, or you haven't learned a kind of sensible risk tolerance.
Yeah.
And so if at that moment you decide to reject your own parents' risk values, rather than just going a bit over the line, which is a totally healthy and sane thing to do, there are people who just go bonkers.
Yeah.
And
we don't let kids make mistakes as small children. All these middle class parents shouting across the soft play, share, Johnny. And it's like,
8th place
actually,
trophies.
let them be a little shit, because they'll learn the hard way that no one will want to play with them. We don't have to intervene on everything.
Yeah.
Let them fall off unless there's going to be a serious head injury. But soft play itself has changed apparently the way that bones break, because kids don't steel themselves for falls anymore. Rubberized playgrounds.
I think it was Jonathan Haidt's book. It was someone's book where they were... No, I know. It's, I'll remember his name in a second. But one writer in America was complaining about the fact that underneath climbing frames, there was sort of padding and it was rubberized.
It was coddling the American mind.
Yeah, I remember having a climbing frame in my local village where the ground was concrete, which actually, even at the time, struck me as a bit extreme, because there is risk of serious brain injury. Let's face it, in the ancestral environment, we'd fall onto grass or leaves or something. Okay, and the concrete, I'm trying to remember who it was who wrote about that. It was a fascinating writer, and he's very much inveighing against this culture of effectively not giving people the opportunity to test their own risk tolerances, which means their instincts for what's sensible and what's crazy don't really develop properly. I thought he was a bit extreme in that, but I mean, it is very interesting how. Also, it's worth noting, of course, that, let's be honest, to a lazy parent, that the one-eyed babysitter is bloody convenient. Because because you plomp a child with you plomp a child with a tablet.
And
tablet basically
babies.
You've got 2 hours to yourself.
Yeah, it's the square row pair. But equally terrifying, and I have found since opening up this conversation that I've become like a priest in a confessional. The first 10 minutes of every meeting I have involves them saying how horrified they are at seeing these devices shoved into pushchairs, and how worried they are about their own attention and focus, and depressed they feel walking around the world and sitting on a train and everyone's eyes down, and their children, everyone talks about their children and their risks there. And I used to stop them and say, yeah, I know. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I thought, no. Let them talk themselves into the problem area. And I say, I cannot keep having this, everybody worrying about this on a personal basis and not being prepared to jump the chasm into the professional conversation. And that is what needs to happen now. We've got, and as we're demonstrating amply, I think, within this conversation, we don't know what the solutions are, but we do know we need to come together to think and talk responsibly, because it's only by coming together that we can have a voice that can ask these questions, that can sit down in collaboration with the platforms and say, what can we do about this? And how can we, as the people that do impact culture so significantly, with our fame, with our passion for what we do, with the eyeballs and the fans that we attract, whether that's Ben, who you're talking to tomorrow, and Gymshark and their great, huge number of fans, or it's the influencer that does, street dance, or whatever it might be. How can we use our influence on culture to actually say this stuff, analog is cool, and we need to reclaim time for it, because the street dancing is analog. The content about it isn't, but the street dancing is. Don't just watch it, do it. And that, or it's gardening, or it's cooking, or it's bird watching. We've got to get these things back into a healthier balance for our own sanity, and take some of this overwhelm out of the world, because the businesses will find there's productivity gains in their own people as well. There's CSR value in it, but there's also brand and marketing power, because this zeitgeist is shifting, with Gary Vee saying that 26 will be the year of unplugged. That's his prediction, that next year will be, that will be the biggest trend of 2026. Gen Z is waking up to this. So there's only opportunity. But people need to come together, I think, to have that conversation. And that's ultimately what I would love to convene in some way. In full acknowledgement, we don't have all the answers, but it has to be a positive conversation, antidote-based, positive, bringing soul back in as something that's actually cool to talk about.
I've also got a weird one, which is, I think driving lessons should start at school. No. I think I know it sounds very weird, but I think the car is an one of the things that always bothers me is that if you, the car is an extraordinarily important kind of rite of passage. Being able to drive, being able to move around, your parents accepting that you are going places on your own. And I think there are all these kind of weird problems which, we've demonized the car, but, or other forms, mopeds, whatever they may be. Okay. But actually, one of the things I think would be quite beneficial is maybe if we had a kind of 15-year-old vehicle that people could use to get around. In France, I can't remember, you can use a moped. Yeah, they are bloody dangerous. I'm going to acknowledge that. But you can use a moped younger than you can drive a car, can't you? That's one of the reasons why there are a load of French people buzzing around on these things. I mean, something like that, so that they could actually, people could socialize autonomously for 3 or 4 years earlier than they currently do.
I love this conversation, first and foremost, especially as somebody that's probably made my career in the digital space. The more that we're having conversations like this, the more we're giving brilliant people like yourself the platform to be able to have this conversation. It's been amazing. Really opened my mind, and it'd be great to have you back.
Anytime. I can't talk about this enough, but it's more in the spirit of us all having this conversation more. So I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to chat about it.
If everybody thinks about the opportunity cost more of the time,
Yeah.
because I think the concentration of conversation is all about the evils of the thing itself, which doesn't quite land. Whereas once you mention the opportunity cost, in other words, what you could have been doing when you were mindlessly scrolling.
Time and attention, our ability to focus. So important. We lose that at our peril as a society. Those, to my mind, are the greatest risks to us as humanity. And yes, there's harms, but time and our attention, it is so precious. And what we give it to dictates the lives that we will have or won't have.
We'll end at that. That's perfect. Amazing. I love that.